Okay, so I'd like to start with a question to Jason. Jason, you mentioned earlier in the introductory video that the Platte River Recovery Program is very different from other recovery programs based on how it's structured and governed. Have these structural differences impacted the program's approach towards achieving its goals? And if yes, then how?
All right. So yes, we've had to take a different approach in a number of ways. As I mentioned at the end of the video, we've had challenges meeting our water objective during the first increment. And originally the program took sort of a standard engineering approach to meeting our water objective, essentially counting on being able to build infrastructure. So build retiming reservoirs, build groundwater recharge systems that would let us put about 20,000 acre feet a year into the ground to meet our water objective. There's one major difference, though, between the program and most typically public subdivisions like NRDs or states or things like that tend to build infrastructure. And that is, those entities often have the power of eminent domain, so they can condemn property to build things. The program does not. So the program was structured as a willing buyer, willing seller program due to some of the conflict early on in negotiation. So every time we buy a piece of property, it either needs to be on the market or we need to work with people to be able to come to an agreement to buy their property. So that ended up being sort of a huge learning experience from my perspective as we moved through the first increment. I see some of the participants are consultants or engineers and things, so this will sound sort of standard to you, but for most infrastructure, water infrastructure projects, you roll out a map and you start circling sites where you might want to build something, and then you go through a process of whittling them down to the best sites, and then you do a preliminary design, and then you start working on a final design to make sure that something's economically feasible, gives you the benefits that you want. And right about that time, you start negotiating with landowners to be able to purchase the property. And then ultimately what happens is if you have a landowner or several landowners that decide they don't want to sell your property, then, with the approval of whatever the governing board is, typically you'd move into condemnation. So those properties would be condemned. The owners would be paid a fair price for their property, but ultimately that's not a roadblock to achieving your water objectives. So the issue that we have is we don't have that ability and haven't had that ability. So, we took a standard approach, specifically with one large reservoir project, where we spent several years looking at feasibility of different sites, moving towards a preliminary design. And then we went sort of at the standard time to talk to the landowners about buying their property. And what we quickly found out is that, something that we, let's say some crop ground that we could have purchased a couple of years before for $4,000 an acre, now that you have a nice engineering drawing of a reservoir on top of that property, it's no longer farmland, it's reservoir land. And so, folks that aren't interested in selling, they may say, we want $25,000 an acre for that property or $50,000 an acre. Quickly, that becomes untenable. When you look at folks who are on our governance committee, there's a lot of federal and state money in our program, and typically those folks are barred from speculative purchase of property. So, they can't pay 500 or 5,000 times the appraised value for something. So, because of that, we kept getting stuck on projects. So retrospect, or in hindsight, what we should have done or what we need to do in order to build things is to go into it from more of a land development perspective, where you're out looking for opportunities to build things. A piece of property comes on the market, you buy it, and then you try to figure out how to design some sort of infrastructure facilities on that piece of property that can provide benefits. The challenge we had there was that, as I mentioned, with state and federal money, you can't speculate. So the idea of going ahead and buying something, holding on to it for several years, and then deciding that it wasn't providing the benefits that you wanted to, and then selling it was also, not palatable from a expenditure perspective with our participants. So fortunately, a lot of the folks that are involved in the program, irrigation districts, states, et cetera, have water that they either lease or own, have facilities. For example, CMPPID is a downstream water user, and they own and operate Lake McConaughey. So as we were struggling to figure out how we were going to meet our water objective, those folks were very proactive and sort of farsighted. And during this time, there was a transition as well at the end of the drought of the early 2000s to being more efficient with their irrigation water. So we were able to find opportunities to lease water from them and also to lease water from individual irrigators and folks like that. So from that perspective, we now are becoming much more successful, and we have a good path towards meeting our water objective. But it looks completely different from both an implementation and a funding approach than it was in 2007 as we were sort of launching off into this process.
Thank you, Jason. That's very interesting. My next question is to George. George, at the end of the introduction section, we played a quote from you, which said that the program is like a marriage in which divorce is not possible due to two horrible economic implications. I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit more about that. And also, as an economist, could you speak about the economic benefits of the program?
Well, to be honest, the quote comes from David Freeman from Colorado State University in his book about the program. And I, of course, glommed onto that quote because I thought it was pretty accurate and fit the situation remarkably well, in the sense that, yeah, it's a marriage in which divorce is not possible. You better get along. You have to. And the consequences of that are economic, being an economist, but I think they're clearly economic in the sense that before the program was created, there was, there was the threatened and endangered species. There were anybody wanting to do any development along the river that required any sort of federal permit had to go through a Section 7 consultation, which assessed their impacts on the endangered species and subsequently had to provide mitigation. The mitigation requirements at that point in the 90s were just prohibitive. And in Colorado, it was a 1-for-1 match from the Front Range to the state line, which really slowed down development and also would have greatly accelerated the pace of buy and dry, which is kind of an outcome a lot of folks in Colorado don't want to talk about or don't want to see. But there are also concerns among other stakeholders, or other impacts that people irrigating in the North Platte system, a lot of that water is federal water, and potential federal actions in some scenarios could have resulted in some of that water having to be dedicated for threatened and endangered species and reducing irrigated acreage in the North Platte system. So there were serious economic consequences from that. Also, it looked like it was for mitigation perspectives for relicensing hydro facilities in Lake McConaughey. The potential mitigation was very uncertain and potentially very expensive. So the creation of the program provided certainty for these things at a reasonable price, at least we think. And before we went too far down the road on the program, we wanted to assess this, and we did it both before Nebraska joined the program for the Central Platte NRD. We did it for the state, and then we did it for the program as a whole after that. But we looked at what are the real savings in the sense of how much is time and money is being saved with Section 7 consultations, with potential mitigation for that. How much is these acreage, the impact of the acreage being taken out of production? What's the impact of that? So we looked at all these potential damages or coming in the form of extended timeframes and mitigation costs. And we came up with a net present value of about in excess of $500 million, probably now closer to $1 billion associated with the net savings associated with having the program intact versus not having the program. So it all translates to money,
Yeah, thank you, George. I see we have a couple of questions from the audience. So I see Francisco raised the hand, so I'm gonna go ahead and ask to unmute. And Please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks for the nice conversation and the novel form to communicate your activities. I really appreciate that. Now, I have a question that has two sides. One is targeting or asked to be asked for Jason, and the other for George. The first one for Jason is, Jason, we think about the implementation of this program as a state-of-the-art way to reconcile local to federal policies and to reconcile missions across agencies or groups. I think this is pretty interesting novel and certainly, as I mentioned, a state-of-the-art in how you can run a program. My question there is related with climate. And with climate change, or with fluctuations, if we don't want to talk about climate change explicitly, with fluctuations on water availability caused by extreme events, how the program incorporates those concepts and how they challenge the mission of the program. That's the question for Jason. The question for George is about the money and the numbers. How we value, right, the cost of the environment and the cost of these potential fluctuations of the environment. And just to give you a hint in what I am pursuing with this question, in one of the videos, you talk about the volatility of the pricing in the crops. Climate is volatile as well. How we can incorporate that into the cost of the engineering projects and into the cost of the sustaining this particular project. So those are the questions I have for them.
All right, so I'll start on the first one, and thank you. Those are very good questions. So yes, climate change and its impacts on flow, water availability are very important to the program. Climate change is sort of tricky for the Platte Basin because you sort of pick your poison in terms of climate models, and you could come to all sorts of outcomes depending on which model you put the most stock in. What we've done specifically is look at scenario planning as an exercise tool under different conditions, say prolonged excessive drought. What potential water supply projects are the most secure in terms of us being able to still manage water and have enough water to implement and meet our species objectives? What we found sort of serendipitously is that water leasing, the approach we're taking now, is actually the best approach because most of that water is tied to very old water rights. It's very secure, very firm water from a supply perspective. So, part of our shift from an engineering approach and retiming excess flows, those are the most vulnerable because of in-stream flow rights and things. Those are sort of trimming the top. We focused on getting as much of a firm supply of sort of old water rights as we can, and then we'll build on top of that. But barring somebody having better perspective on how likely things are to change, we're essentially trying to stack our portfolio with the most resilient water supply projects.
Well,
thank you, Jason.
From the economics perspective, I think Jason kind of hit it there in the sense that we're looking, and a lot of this is moving forward more so than looking backwards, is that we're looking at the older, more established water rights. And then I think our future leases will reflect that. And also we are, in some of our future leases, we hope, we're looking at working with irrigators up in the North Platte Basin who have some very secure water rights and storage that they get to some degree with that. And we've been looking, and a lot of their infrastructure is in really bad shape. So we've been looking at ways we can help pay for infrastructure and then get some leased water potentially. We won't call it leased water, but when we can arrange that maybe we can use the water when they don't need it. Related to that, we're not just leasing water. We hope not to just be leasing water on an annual basis, although we will be doing that. But we're also trying to work in, I guess, some we'll call it innovations that maybe Colorado has been looking at in the sense of dry year options or wet year options, in the sense that we might be able to, for these senior rights who have storage, maybe we can, on wet years, we can store some of that excess water and then use it in years when we don't, allowing the irrigators to keep the water in the dry years. And will have taken their water, leased their water from the wet years. So I guess it's mostly, the answer is mostly moving forward in our irrigator leases, I guess.
Well, thank you both.
Yes, thank you, Francisco, for an amazing question. That was a really, really great question. We have another one in the chat box, asks about the length of leases. So are they 1 year long or are they longer? George, maybe you can answer that question.
They're 1 year, right, at the moment. And that's kind of winds down our pilot program with Central Nebraska Public Power and Irrigation District. Future leases will be of longer duration, probably 3 to 5 years, starting our next set of leases starting in 2022 or 2023. We'll offer leases of that variety. In the past, our lease program, it was a pilot program, and frankly, it took a few years to get going. And in the pilot sense, the irrigators were more comfortable doing it a year at a time. And well, that's what, it's all about relationship building. So if that's what it takes to build a relationship, we went with that. And as Renata, in fact, you were with the irrigators in a workshop with myself last summer, where they have now stated that something longer would be more beneficial for them, giving them more planning certainty, something in the order of 3 to 5 years, which in fact was kind of music to our ears, because that's what we want, because that's something we can take to the bank with the program. A little bit of certainty, 3 to 5 years, we can, we have certainty with that particular supply. So those things are moving in the right direction, but regrettably, so far, our leases have been 1 year at a time as part of the pilot program. So.
Thanks, George. I see another question. Peter raised hand, so go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Renata. Thank you, Jason and George. Really enjoyed the presentation. Great to get these insights into your project. Well done. And great to hear a shout out from my old sociology professor at Colorado State, David Freeman. I didn't realize he'd written a book on the Platte, so I need to dig that one out. This is just a kind of, I like to do this in terms of a project like this, where I think there's a lot of important lessons and insights for others, and particularly people who are maybe working in river systems that aren't as well developed, haven't reached this level of demand on the system, but are faced with these kind of questions. If you were to cast your mind back to the 1930s and make a recommendation here on the Platte, what should we be doing to have avoided this situation, which is really progressive, yet of course it's been expensive to do this?
You want to start, George?
Well, it's always easier to respond to a crisis than it is to try to prevent one, I think, I guess, because I would just imagine. But it would have been nice to have something like a governance committee pre-development. I don't know what it would have taken to create that pre-development, because maybe a lot of the stakeholders at that time wouldn't have seen the need. But it would have been nice, because the governance committee has turned out to be a really wonderful level of organization to work with, since it does represent the stakeholders who have a lot of experience in the basin, and it's very on the ground experience too. And also, we're sort of unencumbered by, I wouldn't say unencumbered by federal influences or government influences, but we can really listen to everyone equally. Well, anyway, I'm trying to just think of an analogous situation, and I guess I can't think of one at the moment. But I know in the Fort Collins area with the Northern Integrated Supply Project, they are looking at how the governance of the Platte River Recovery Program is going, and what lessons we're learning, and trying to apply it to the Poudre Basin with respect to the development of the NISP facilities. Unfortunately, it's maybe a little late there too. It might have been better if that had started 10 years ago, but I guess collaborative oversight or collaborative governance of a river system might be the way to avoid these things.
Great answer, George.
I would just add, from a water supply, water use perspective, this wasn't even on anybody's radar, but building in environmental flow rights, in-stream flow rights, that sort of thing before your basin is over appropriated creates room to be able to maintain, we exist because the river changed so much over the course of 40 to 50 years that Fish and Wildlife Service indicated it would cause jeopardy for endangered species. So in developing basins, there's a bunch of different methods now that let you sort of put a pin in environmental flows and try to maintain, different important parts of the hydrograph and reduce over abstraction. So that today that would be something that would be very useful. But I mean, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, even in the Platte Basin, all of these relatively progressive states from a water supply perspective, you always hear any drop that goes over the state line is wasted water, right? You got to use it all, every drop. And I still hear that, as long as you're the upstream state, if you're downstream, that's your position. If you're upstream, you have a different position. But, just the baseline recognition that, there are regulations and some places there aren't, but in the United States, there is an Endangered Species Act that, if the physical environment changes enough that you have impacts on species, will likely require you to back things up from a water supply perspective. And it's really painful to do that. So if you proactively can protect a portion of your hydrograph or your water supply for natural or environmental purposes, it's painful up front, but it'll prevent you from having all sorts of back end issues of trying to unwind, water infrastructure and irrigation and all the things that we're dealing with right now.
Thank you, Peter, for a question, and Jason, George, for your answers. I know we're out of time, but we have one more question in the chat, and I'm gonna go ahead and ask it because I have imagination that many of the audience might want to hear that answer. So it's gonna be for you, George, I think. And if you can just be quick with your answer, that'd be great. So have you thought about using an index such as crop price or stream flow to adjust your lease prices from year to year and allow comfort with longer term leases?
Yes, we have. And yes, we will do that on the longer term leases, depending on the length of term and how we negotiate with the irrigators. But we fully intend to do that. We have worked on leases, proposed leases in the past with Central CNPP idea, and we have got into discussion how we index these costs. And we have looked at several different types of indexes, some sort of weighted average crop prices, and also we've looked at CPIs and studied the heck out of these things and which is the most appropriate. But I also I know Nick has talked about the stream flow, incorporating that in the index, which I think is a neat idea. We'll talk more about that. But yeah, we have thought about that. And I mean, we wouldn't expect irrigators to buy into a long-term program unless they're somehow protected against or somehow can get benefit of high crop prices. That's not good for us because it introduces high volatility, but they're not going to lease as much if they can't, get some appreciation of the high crop prices.
Great. Thank you, George.